Okay, so we are on part 2 of trig functions of any angle. So if you have not watched part 1, make sure you go back and watch part 1 before you watch part 2. Okay, so just a review again of trig functions. Remember we have sine, cosine, and tangent. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. And then we have the reciprocal functions. So cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. And cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. So when we evaluate trig functions of any angle, first thing we want to do is we want to check and see if it's a point on the unit circle. If it is, then you can just use your trig functions to figure it out. If it's not on the unit circle, we might want to set up a right triangle, or use our formulas from our formula sheet. So you will need your formula sheet today. Okay, so one chart you're going to have memorized for calculus and for this course, but especially for calculus, we use this a lot. These are the trig functions that you have to have memorized. So you're going to want your unit circle out with you today. So if you don't have it out, go ahead and pause and grab your unit circle. Okay, so let's go ahead and write down these answers. So I'm going to start with 0 degrees. Now on the unit circle, here we have 0 degrees right here. Cosine is the x, sine is the y. So sine is 0, cosine is 1. I'm just going to do sine and cosine for all of these, and then I'm going to do the other functions. 30 degrees, that's our first angle here. Cosine is root 3 over 2, sine is 1/2. "45 degrees, they are both root 2 over 2. "60 degrees, cosine is 1/2, sine is root 3 over 2. "90 is up at the top. Cosine is 0, sine is 1. "180 is over on the left side here. Cosine is -1, sine is 0. "270 is at the bottom. Cosine is 0, sine is -1. And then 360 is the same as 0, so 0, 1. Okay, so tangent we know is sine over cosine. So 0 over 1 is 0. For 30 degrees, 1/2 over root 3 over 2 would be 1 over root 3. Now, 1 over root 3, if I multiply by root 3, I get root 3 over 3. For 45, root 2 over 2 divided by root 2 over 2 is 1. For 60, root 3 over 2 divided by 1/2, the 2's cancel, and that's just root 3. For 90, 1 divided by 0, we cannot divide by 0, so that is undefined. That's where we would have an asymptote if we were to graph this. 180, 0 over -1 is 0. 270, -1 over 0 is undefined. And then 0 over 1 is 0. Okay, so cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So if I flip 0, so if I make 0 a fraction, 0 over 1, if I flip it, I get 1 over 0, so that's undefined. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so 1 over 1 is still 1 over 1. And cotangent, the opposite of 0, is undefined. Now on to 30. Cosine or cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, so 1 over 2 becomes 2. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so 2 over root 3 becomes 2 root 3 over 3 when I flip it. And if I flip root 3 over 3, that becomes 3 over root 3. 3 root 3 over 3 is just root 3. Cosecant of 45. 2 over root 2 becomes 2 root 2 over 2, which is just root 2. Secant would be the same, and the reciprocal of 1 is 1. Cosecant of 60, 2 over root 3 would be 2 root 3 over 3. Secant would be 2. And then if I flip root 3 over 1, that becomes 1 over root 3, which is root 3 over 3. For 90 degrees, cosecant, the reciprocal of 1 is 1, the reciprocal of 0 is undefined, and then the opposite, the reciprocal of undefined, would be 0. For 180, cosecant would be undefined. Secant, if I make negative 1 over 1 and flip it, it's still negative 1, and then we got undefined. For 270, cosecant would be negative 1, secant would be undefined, and cotangent would be 0. For 360, it's going to be the same as 0, so undefined, 1, and undefined. Okay, so you're going to want to practice this. There's going to be a blank reference sheet for you to practice with. If we normally were in class, I would be giving you a big quiz on this chart, so you want to make sure you know all of these trig functions. Okay, so let's go to the back. Let's try a couple examples. We're just going to evaluate using our unit circle. So number 1, we have the cosine of 4 pi over 3. So first I'm going to check and see if that's on my unit circle. And if you look in the third quadrant, you'll see 4 pi over 3 right here. Cosine is the x, so the answer is negative 1/2. Number 2, tangent of negative 210. So I'm going to use my unit circle. Now normally 210 is in the third quadrant. That's 7 pi over 6. If I'm going negative though, I'm going to go that same distance, but I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So that would put me at 150 instead. So my question is the tangent. So tangent is sine over cosine. So if I took 1/2 over negative root 3 over 2, I'm going to write that down. The 2's cancel, so I'm left with 1 over negative root 3, and that simplifies to negative root 3 over 3. Okay, last one, 11 pi over 4. Now that is not on the unit circle. 2 pi over 4 is the same thing as 8 pi over 4. So if I went 9 pi over 4, 10 pi over 4, 11 pi over 4. It would be in the same spot as 3 pi over 4. Now the question is asking for cosecant. So that's the reciprocal of sine. Sine is root 2 over 2. So if I write that as 2 over root 2, that would become 2 root 2 over 2, which is root 2. Okay, number 4. Let theta be an angle in quadrant 2 such that sine is 1/3. Find the cosine by using trig identities. So we could do a right triangle in quadrant 2, and we could solve it that way. But it says to use a trig identity. So we're looking for cosine, and we know sine. So I want to look at my formula sheet and see if I can find a formula that has sine and cosine in it. So you can pause the video, go and look at your formula sheet and see if you can find a formula that you could use. Okay, so hopefully you found the Pythagorean identity. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. because if I know sine, I can plug that in and solve for cosine. 1/3 squared is 1/9. I would subtract that from both sides. That gives me 8/9, and then take the square root. When I take a square root, it's plus or minus, so that's √8/3. Now, plus or minus, depending on what quadrant I'm in, I have to figure out if cosine's positive or negative there. So I'm in the second quadrant. All students take calculus. So in the second quadrant, which is where I'm at, quadrant 2, it says right here, sine is the only thing positive, so that means cosine is negative. So the cosine of theta is equal to negative √8/3. Now you can simplify that. √8 reduces to reduces to 2√2, so you could also write that as negative 2√2/3. Okay, last part here, we're going to use our calculator to evaluate. So the main thing is knowing what mode you should be in. So 5 should be in degree mode. And then the other two, there's no degree symbol. So for both of these, we should be in radians. So real quick, let's go ahead and set our calculator mode to degrees to start us out with. So go to your mode, highlight degrees, and cotangent. So I'm going to type that in as 1/tangent of 410. And we'll do 3 places, so 0.839. Okay, so now for 6 and 7, I'm going to change my mode back to radians. And for 6, we have the sine of -7. So that's negative 0.657. And then for 7, we have the secant. So I'm going to type that in my calculator as 1/cosine. Now, if you have the Inspire, you don't have to worry about using reciprocals. You have those on there. So 1 divided by cosine of pi/9 gives me 1.064. Okay, so that concludes the part 2 of the trig functions. So feel free to go back and rewatch anything you had difficulties with, and don't forget to practice your trig function chart.